Hello everyone. In this video, we will learn how to mock GraphQL queries that happen inside your React unit test cases. So to understand what GraphQL is, I will leave a link in the description. You can learn what that is. Uh, and the let's discuss about the problem that we are trying to solve in this video. So traditionally, to handle the to maintain our code, we write test cases. It's a good practice to have. So it becomes complex when the application that we are trying to test or the React components that we are trying to test makes API calls. So to handle that, either we run an actual backend server that will handle the request that the test case is making, or we mock the API calls inside the test case itself. The test case itself will handle the API calls that the component is making. So it adds another layer of complexity when you have GraphQL in your application. So in this video, we will learn how to handle this. So you don't have to run a dedicated backend server just to run your test cases. Uh, you can directly run it in your front end. You don't need to run a backend server to handle the test cases. So let's start by creating a simple empty React project, then we can move from there. So open your terminal and in your project directory, just create a new project. We have installed an empty React project. Let's go into the React project. So I'm naming this React project as mock GraphQL. So now we have the project ready. So let's install the necessary packages that we will be using in this project. So we'll be using multiple things. First, we need to set up GraphQL. Then we have to set up the testing environment. So for that to make relay work, we need the relay compiler, the Babel plugin for that, and React Relay as well. So we'll be using testing React library. Let's install that, and and we'll be using a few more packages specifically for testing this. So they are this React testing utils and React test runner. So these packages are now installed. We have saved it. So let's open the project and let's see. So I have the project opened here. So every the dependencies that we added are already in package.json here. So let's start with adding a GraphQL schema. So using the schema, we can it will have the definitions that the backend is ready to handle. If you're familiar with GraphQL, you'll know what this is. I'm not going to dive deep into it. Uh, so once we have the schema to set up GraphQL, open your package.json and you have to add this script here in your package.json to set up relay. So it's pretty simple. We are giving our working directory. We are pointing to where our schema file is, schema.graphql. We have mentioned that, and we'll be mentioning what language that we are going to use. So once we have that set up, let's also add a command to to build our queries and mutations. I have added a command called r relay compiler, and which will run the entire which will build all the GraphQL queries that we have in the application. So now let's set up relay first. So let's create a folder called relay. Then let's create a file called index.js inside it. So we'll add uh, some code into it. So let's quickly go through what is added here. So if you are familiar with with relay and GraphQL, this will be self-explanatory. So you are to make GraphQL API calls using relay, there are a few ways. We have queries and mutations. So to trigger a query, we have to use the fetch query API that relay provides, and we'll be passing the test environment here. So I mean, we'll be using this here. So I will get to this in just a second. What you need to know is we have to set up a network function that has the fetch method that will make the actual GraphQL API call, and we'll be passing in the headers, the body, and we have to create the environment here. The environment, we have to supply this network function as the network parameter in the environment, and we have to pass in the record source also. And finally, we'll be using this environment here inside the fetch query method to make API calls. So when we are testing it, when we are running a test case, we'll be passing a different environment. We will get to this in just a second. So as of now, yeah, that's what we have added in this file. So let's next add the queries and mutations. So create another folder called GraphQL, and here create two more folders called query and mutation. So if you're familiar with relay, you will understand why we need this GraphQL folder. So the the reason why we need this GraphQL folder is relay has a convention where the queries that we have to that we write depends on the file name that we put it in. You can read more about it. I will add a link in the description. More about how to set up relay and the conventions that we have to follow in relay. So I have created a file called hello.js, and I need to add the first query here. So let's add the first query into the file. So this is a GraphQL query. So to explain what this is actually doing, we are calling the hello query here. So the hello query, we have declared it here, and as you can see, it returns a string. It's a very simple uh, GraphQL query. So let's add a mutation. Mm, let's call it post.js. We are trying to handle this mutation. So uh, let me add the mutation. So once we have the mutation, uh, let's then create a React component that we will be using to test. I'm going to create a component called testing.js. So let's I will add some boilerplate code, some code for this. So I will quickly explain what this code is, what this component does. So you have a import statement that imports the hello query, and we are importing the fetch query method that we just created. So and here we are just rendering the text in the body, in the page. We are making an API call. So in the API call, we'll be calling the hello query using the fetch query helper function that we created earlier. We'll be passing the query here. Right now we don't have any parameters, so we are keeping that as empty. I will get to this environment in just a second. As of now, what you need to understand is when this component loads, when this React component loads, we'll be making the API call. So yeah. that's that's all we need to worry about. It will make an API call that will trigger a GraphQL. I mean, we will be making a GraphQL API call. So this is exactly what we need to for this particular video. So we need some more helper functions. Let's create a folder called testutils under src, and let's add a file called testutils.js inside it. So let me add some more boilerplate code here. So yeah, the to explain what this does is we have added a helper function here that helps with rendering our components in the test case. So we have a provider here. I will come back in just a second to explain what this is. To So basically what you need to understand here is we'll be passing a component, and this helper function will help with rendering the component inside the test case. So now finally let's add the actual test script under the src folder. Mocking test. I will name that as mock.test.js. So let's add the code for testing. So let's go through what we have here in the testing in this test case. So we have imported a few things from the dependency called React mock environment and mock payload generator. So let's start from the top. So this is where the test case actually starts. So first things first, we'll be creating a mock environment, a test environment that will be needed by relay. So we'll be using the custom render function that we just added. So that we just added here to render the testing component that we just added. So this is the testing component that we added that we are going to test. We'll be rendering that, and then we'll be passing this test environment that we created into the testing component as a parameter here. So remember that we were getting an environment here. So we pass that environment into the fetch query function that makes the actual GraphQL API call. So if you go there, so whenever we are testing, we pass the testing environment into the GraphQL method, into the fetch query method. Whenever we are running the application normally, we will be using this environment that we are having here. So that's the reason why we are passing this testing environment. So just to recap, we have created a mock environment, and we will be passing that into the testing component, which fetch query will use to make the API calls. So coming into the gist of the test case, so the first thing we need to do is we have to fetch the initial operations that the component is making, the initial GraphQL calls that the component is making. If you go back, you will see that we are making an API call when the component is getting loaded. So that's where those are the API calls that we are trying to mock here. We are in this case we are just making one call, but this is written in a way that we can handle multiple too. So that's why we are first getting all the operations, then inside React test renderer we are looping through the individual operations, all the operations with the environment that we just created. We'll be mocking the individual requests. We'll be passing the operations as a parameter into the environment, and we use the mock payload generator. So this will help with generating the payload for each of the individual GraphQL operations. So to go more into So this section called string will resolve every string that is present in the API call. Uh, that it will resolve all the strings in the GraphQL API call, and this ID will resolve every ID that is present in the GraphQL API call. So this string is the string that I'm talking here. So this hello query will resolve into a string. So which means that when uh, when we when testing is hitting the hello query, it will need a string. So this section that we have written here will resolve in the GraphQL query. We'll be sending back this text called sample. We can do anything here. So this is a function, so we can do anything here. We can pass any text here. So and we also like string is one type, and we can also resolve other types like ID here. So that's why we also have ID here. So that's what this mock payload generator needs to mock our data. So the last step is we just wait for it to run, wait for the API call to run. Uh, it, Even though we are running that inside the testing environment, it will take a few milliseconds and to run the GraphQL query to make the API call. So the test case won't wait for that until we run it. So we have to wait for it. I have given the timeout as 2 seconds, which is fairly lot, but just as a buffer. And we'll be checking whether the remember that we were just rendering the text that the GraphQL query is sending back inside the state variable. So the state variable will we are setting the text that we are getting back from the GraphQL query into the screen, nothing else. So which means that this sample is will be printed in the screen, and we just have to get the text, whether this text called sample is present in the screen. So yeah, so once we have that ready, we we can move forward and run the test case. Oh yeah, I forgot to run relay. Okay, now the queries are compiled, and as you can see, our test case ran successfully. So you can see this console log dot sample over here. I will show you where that came from. So this console log came from over here in this line, which which means that our whatever data that we passed through the test case actually got into the component, and we are rendering that in the in the screen. That's why we are getting this that's why this test case is getting successful. So yeah. So that's how you mock GraphQL queries that happen inside your React application. So to go further into our setup, so you I'm sure you remember why we have added this here. So you can see that we have added a fragment and added a provider on top of it. So when you try to implement the same setup into your own React app, most modern React applications that are in production will use some some state management tool, like the popular one is Redux. So you want the component that you're trying to test probably won't have this setup. It won't make the calls from here. It will probably have the logic and all in the in the Redux saga, or I mean in the Redux reducers, or the actions functions wherever we are handling it. So you can add the provider for the entire Redux store over here, so that whatever component that you're rendering here will have access to the data that is in the store. So this is why we have this provider function. It's easier. You just have to import it, just cover the component with that. So that's one thing. In this example, we saw how to mock a GraphQL query. So you don't need to make any further changes to mock GraphQL mutation. The mutation will behave the same way. You don't have to change anything here. Remember that I told you that we are fetching the initial operations, initial GraphQL API calls using this method. Let's say that you make more API calls in your component as the user interacts with the page. You will have to write separate mocking logic for that, and including the string and id here. I mean, we are mocking the string and id here, so we are not constrained to only using string and id. We can write mocking for user here. So in this example, we have a type called user. Our mutation post will send back a user type. So we can also mark a type here, this user type. So we just have to add that along with the other mocking. So this is not the exact syntax. I will leave a description to explain this, that will explain this in detail. And I have added the entire source code that we have explored here into a GitHub repository. I will add that into the description. To I have also created a blog of whatever we have gone through. If you prefer to follow that, you could also refer my blog to follow the same. And yeah, I think I covered everything. So please leave a comment if you have any questions, and please subscribe to the channel for more tutorials like